to participating in the top 12 of the National We the People competition. We're going to introduce ourselves and ask you to introduce yourselves and your teacher. Then I will read the question. We're going to ask you about question 1 this morning. We'll hear your opening statement, have a chance to ask you some questions, and conclude with some feedback. My name is Dan Taubman. I'm a senior judge on the Colorado Court of Appeals in Denver, Colorado.
My name is Susan Firestone. I'm a retired patent and trademark attorney from Fort Wayne, Indiana.
And I'm Mike Miles from Birmingham, Alabama. And it looks like every person that lives in California is on the screen with us right this minute. I'm glad, Stacy, you got a bunch of smart people you brought to see us this morning. We're glad about that. Good luck to all three of you. This is going to be so much fun. Thank you.
So would you like to introduce yourselves and your teacher, please?
Good morning. We are Unit 3 from Amador Valley High School, representing the Golden State of California. My name is Gianni Chidipodu, and I'd like to thank you for listening to our testimony today.
Good morning. My name's Leah Allery.
And I'm Yvette Allery. Once again, we'd like to thank you for listening to our testimony today. We'd also like to thank our coach, Miss Sklar, and our timer, Miss Taylor Tama.
Thank you, judges. I'm going to turn off my camera.
That's fine. Thank you. Let me read the question now. The right to vote was not expressly included in the U.S. Constitution of 1787. In your opinion, was the implied right to vote in the Constitution sufficient for the creation of a representative democracy? How did the expansion of voting rights after the evolution of democracy or how did the expansion of voting rights affect the evolution of democracy in our country? Please give examples. Which is the greater threat to democracy, disenfranchisement or fraud? Explain your position. You may begin.
A man without a vote is a man without protection. President Lyndon B. Johnson. The ballot box is proclaimed as the protector of liberties, yet it is not protected itself. A lack of its explicit protection has left groups powerless to an unrepresentative government.
Not only has an implied right to vote in the Constitution been insufficient in the creation of a representative democracy, but the founders never intended for it. The founders didn't believe everyone was worthy of a right to vote. Professor Donald Ratcliffe argues in his 2013 University of Pennsylvania article that the founders believed the, quote, poor and idle, including women and Black Americans, were not stakeholders in the government and would corrupt the political process. This perceived inferiority shut groups out of our democracy from the beginning.
The implied right to vote has enabled the court to inconsistently protect suffrage, weakening our representative democracy. Although the court implied a fundamental right to vote in Reynolds v. Sims 1964, less progressive courts have diminished it. In Burdick v. Takushi 1992, the court held the right to vote isn't absolute, and any law imposing a burden on voting isn't always subject to strict scrutiny. Weak protection enables discriminatory practices, leaving minorities vulnerable to an oppressive government.
Therefore, our Constitution needs an explicit right to vote through an amendment, ideally mirroring Article 3, Sections 1 and 3 of Illinois' Constitution. This would ensure every citizen of voting age the right to vote and guarantee free and fair elections. Additionally, Congress could set minimum election standards through an enforcement provision.
Even without an explicit right to vote, the expansion of voting rights has 1. Made our democracy more representative, and 2. Increased civic engagement. Expanding voting rights pushed our government to be more representative. From 1869 to 1920, 18 states granted women's suffrage. As Grant Miller argued in his 2008 Stanford Medicine article, expanding suffrage caused the child mortality rate to decline by around 15%. Over time, policy has become more reflective of the nation as suffrage has expanded.
Additionally, expanding voting rights promotes civic engagement. After Hyattsville, Maryland lowered its voting age to 16, not only were people under 18 4 times more likely to vote than those over 18, but the city also created a teen advisory committee to increase youth interest in government. More expansive voting rights promotes civic engagement.
However, democratic progress is threatened by the continuous assault on voting rights. Therefore, disenfranchisement is more prevalent and dangerous than fraud, causing it to be a greater threat to democracy. Fraud is not prevalent, and the rhetoric around it is often a political tool used to purposefully disenfranchise groups. During his 2018 governor campaign, Georgia's Secretary of State Brian Kemp instituted a voter roll purge to prevent voter fraud. 53,000 voters were purged, 70% of whom were Black. Yet fraud isn't as prevalent as Kemp claims. In a 2014 study by Professor Justin Levitt, there were only 31 credible incidents of impersonation out of 1 billion ballots surveyed. Through outlandish claims of fraud, minorities are deliberately denied the right to vote.
Furthermore, disenfranchisement is more destructive, harming minorities' opportunities to vote. Shelby County v. Holder 2013 struck down the coverage formula of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, removing required federal approval to change election procedures in jurisdictions with histories of voter discrimination. Immediately after, states passed restrictive laws, like North Carolina's HB 589, which imposed a strict voter ID requirement that disproportionately affected people of color. This escalating disenfranchisement has diluted minorities' power, making it a greater threat.
Today's methods of disenfranchisement are not so different from our framers. They're continuing a long line of political oppression. With more than 440 restrictive voting bills passed just this year alone, the opportunity to vote is still being left unprotected. More must be done to safeguard the protector of liberties. Thank you.
So you mentioned in your opening statement that you're concerned about all kinds of bills and laws that have been enacted to restrict voting. In your view, are there any kinds of restrictions or limitations on voting that would be appropriate?
Yes, there are proper limitations on voting. In our home state of California, we have anti-electioneering laws, like in California Elections Code, Section 319.5, which states that it's a criminal offense to electioneer at the polls based on the fact that it causes voter intimidation and can threaten the integrity of an election.
Another example of voting regulations that are helpful is also present in our home state of California in Code of Elections Section 92504, which states that all elections must have a paper trail. This ensures more secure elections and makes it easier and ensures more secure elections.
However, just because there are some valid restrictions doesn't mean that we should be letting restrictions continue to limit people's right to vote. For example, I think that many voter ID laws are too restrictive, especially government-issued voter IDs, because they discriminate against certain minorities, especially Native Americans. For example, a voter ID law in North Carolina made it so that 19% of Native Americans did not have the requisite voter ID, compared to 8% of the rest of the general population. I think this reflects how when we restrict the vote, we need to make sure it doesn't hurt minorities.
Which do you think is a greater problem, to restricting voting, gerrymandering or disenfranchisement?
I think that gerrymandering is a bigger issue today because of the way that the Supreme Court looks at it. The Supreme Court often thinks of partisan gerrymandering as a political question, as was shown in Rujo v. Common Cause 2018. And because of this, there aren't many measures that are set in place to prevent gerrymandering that dilutes people's right to vote.
I disagree with that. I think that disenfranchisement is a greater threat, and this can be reflected in a 2014 UC San Diego law review article, which found that the use of voter ID laws decreased voter turnout for communities of color by approximately 8%. This statistic shows that disenfranchisement plays a greater threat to our democracy.
However, while both gerrymandering and voter disenfranchisement are prevalent, I think gerrymandering has been a lasting issue. And the court has acknowledged this, as in V. Jubilar 2004. In Justice Kennedy's concurrence, he notes that gerrymandering does not only subvert the principle of one person, one vote, but also subverts the principle of the freedom of association, as partisan gerrymandering, although a political question, does infringe on one's right to the freedom of association by the fact that it prevents someone from having their party representing them.
Thank you.
You used a great phrase in your essay about the assault on voting rights from state to state, and my state's one of the worst ones. The two questions you've had over the weekend in order to arrive here on Monday, and I can tell you deserve to be here, you're doing a great job, dealt with voting rights on the one hand and equal protection under the law on the other. But if a convicted felon can vote in California but can't in Alabama, if Georgia's rolls get purged and South Carolina's don't, does the Constitution fail the voter in those states that successfully assault the rights to vote, does the Constitution fail to keep their promise to those people of equal protection under the law by leaving this to the states to set the standards?
Yes, I think the Constitution definitely does fail the voter by making it easier for some voters to vote in other states compared to the more restrictive states. And I think that reflects how putting an explicit right to vote in our Constitution is an extremely important thing to do, because as noted by Representative Jamie Raskin in a 2001 paper after the issue with Bush v. Gore 2000, where an issue with minimum election standards led to allegations of fraud and issues with the election, I think it shows how having an explicit right to vote would really be an important way to set minimum election standards so that everyone can have the equal ability to be able to vote.
Yes, and our current amendment would remedy current discrepancies state to state through these minimum election standards, in which we have a free and fair elections clause. Yale political scientist Robert Dahl has defined the free and fair elections clause as an election in which coercion is comparatively uncommon. By stating fair, it means that every vote is equal, and that ensures that Congress must uphold this and ensure that minimum election standards ensure that the right to vote is unimpeded.
Yeah, Dahl wrote some really powerful things on this subject. He did, and I've had to read some of it over the weekend because he's been mentioned. Is there anything he wrote that you disagree with?
I do agree. I do disagree with his fact that his idea that we shouldn't have judicial review. I think on the issue of voting, judicial review is a powerful mechanism that the court has outlined because of the case Marbury versus Madison, 1803, in which the power of judicial review allows the court to strike down actions that are unconstitutional. This is essential to voting. However, I think Dahl's theory that we shouldn't have judicial review is incorrect.
I think you're right. Judge Kalman, I assume that you agree with Leah that judicial review is a good idea. Is that right?
Most of the time, yes.
Go ahead.
Can you tell us what constitutional amendments have been ratified that address the issue of voting, and whether you think we need any other constitutional amendments in this area?
Yes, the 15th Amendment is kind of the biggest place where we look to for our voting rights today. The 15th Amendment expanded suffrage to all for Black Americans specifically, and it's what's being used in Congress to pass legislation and such as the John Lewis Voting Rights Act or HB1. This was the basis that they used for passing the VRA of 1965, and it's where we see most of our voting protections found.
The 19th Amendment and the 19th Amendment and the 26th Amendment were also important in expanding suffrage to women and people over the age of 18, respectively. However, the term the right to vote has been mentioned in the Constitution 4 times, but only as sort of like a negative application instead of an explicit application, which is why we think we need an explicit right to vote to more profoundly state that everyone in the country who are citizens in a voting age should have the right to vote.
And to answer the second part of your question, I think that we need to enfranchise and give political voting, presidential voting rights to citizens of U.S. territories and Commonwealth. This is because currently citizens that reside in Puerto Rico, because of the case Igartua de la Rosa v. U.S. 2000, don't have presidential voting rights. We need to remedy this by passing House Joint Resolution 24, proposed in 2019, which would allow for presidential voting rights for citizens in U.S. territories, because they have a vested interest and they have the right to be represented by our executive.
Yeah, I'm going to turn this a little bit on your ear. You're talking about people who trying to get access to the polls, but we have a lot of people in the country, certainly in Indiana, that are able to vote or are of the age to vote. They may even be registered voters, but they don't show up to the polls on polling day. You have any explanation for why that would be, or how to remedy that? Either one.
Yes, voter apathy is actually a result of the lack of access. According to the American Bar Association's 2020 analysis on voter apathy, they found a strong connection between voter apathy and the lack of access, as 15% of Black Americans had difficulty finding polling stations compared to only 4% of white Americans. In this way, it shows the discrepancy between, it's not that people don't want to vote, it's that going out to vote is extremely difficult.
I agree with Leah. This can be the idea that voter access is directly linked with voter apathy is reflected in a 2014 Stanford article by Stephen Lee, where he found that under perfect circumstances, under minimum voting regulations, we saw an increase in voter turnout by approximately 12%, showing that voter access is directly linked with voter apathy.
But to answer the second part of your question, expanding suffrage could help lower voter apathy, as was shown in Sweden. When they lowered their voting age to 16, there was a voter participation rate of 70% over those under the age of 18. And because of that and the idea of civic engagement, it also led for voter turnout to increase across the nation.
Well, this is a strange question to ask, but Susan's got me thinking really hard this weekend with her questions about that. Those 30% that didn't come out, or in some cases 40 or 50%. Is that so bad if they don't care enough to vote, if they don't care enough to keep up, if they don't care enough to know more about the candidates, if all they're watching is an echo chamber on one end or the other? Are we eager to get them on out to vote if they're not willing to do the preparation that the three of you have done?
No, it is still a bad thing because you have to put into perspective that a lot of people who aren't going out. May I please finish my thought?
Judge, can she finish? Do you mind?
Yes, go ahead and finish your sentence.
The people who aren't going out to vote are sometimes also people who are people of color who are face voter apathy because of long history of discrimination.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Judge. Thank you for letting her finish.
Let's show our appreciation for the team.
Congratulations, and the judges will give you their feedback now.
Well, let me congratulate you for an excellent presentation this morning. I don't think I've ever seen so many articles cited in a We the People presentation in all the years I've been judging We the People students. So that demonstrates that you've done a tremendous amount of research to consider all aspects of this question. I think you had a very good discussion in your opening statement about the history of how voting rights have expanded over time. I don't think you mentioned the 24th Amendment about the poll tax, and either in your opening statement or in response to my question about what constitutional amendments there have been regarding voting. But I'm sure that you're familiar with that amendment. I was, excuse me. I was impressed with the statistics you had on how restrictions on voting have led to specific amounts of disenfranchisement of voters. That shows a great deal of study and knowledge about that specific issue. When you were talking about the importance of the 15th Amendment, you might have mentioned Clause 2 of the 15th Amendment, which specifically authorizes enforcement of that amendment by legislation in Congress. And as you know, the Civil Rights Amendments were the first amendments that had enforcement clauses like that. But you did mention specifically that the Voting Rights Act was done pursuant to that enforcement provision, which was very good. When you're talking about voter apathy and the lack of access, one thing that you might have mentioned is the provision that we have in Colorado and some other states, which is mail-in voting, which has led to in Colorado over 90% of eligible voters voting in the 2020 election. But that's a relatively minor point. I think, as I said at the outset, that I think you did an excellent job of addressing all aspects of the question.
I too enjoyed your remarks and your presentation. It was nicely done. You had so many things in there that I was starting to get my notes. But I think you mentioned at one point even allowing women to vote. There was a decrease in infant mortality rate. I thought, Well, I certainly didn't expect that. But even-
I didn't either.
but even better was, I think, that the follow-up and the fact that you were always good, no matter who was talking, at defining your terms,
Yeah.
which is very important to me, is that you do define your terms so we know what you're saying and what you are planning to say, and it's nicely done. I enjoyed it very much and wish we had more time because we could talk about what it's like to living in states where you're always going to be in the minority in a political party or what your beliefs are. So, but thank you. It was a job well done.
Yeah, I'm the poster child, Susan, for that. Living in Alabama, I'm the poster child for being in the minority. Leah and Yvette, are y'all sisters?
Yeah.
Yeah.
My greatest fear was not recognized. I was so afraid Yvette was going to say something and Leah was going to say, I deeply agree with my colleague, and then all heck was going to break loose. So I'm glad that didn't happen today. And I'm glad y'all covered all the sides without getting into it a little bit. Yeah, I wish, Judge Talman was talking about the level turnout they have there. I wish we had more time for him to tell you how they reelect judges in Colorado, the manner in which they used to do it. It takes a lot of the politics out of it. And boy, I wish that was true down here. I really was serious about the last question I asked, and I'll close with this. I know members of my family, extended members of my family, really good friends of mine that I go to ball games with and that kind of thing, that it's okay with me that they don't go vote because they're single issue candidates and they get all stirred up about the wrong thing. And that's the wrong way for me to feel. What I wish is that they watched more than one echo chamber and that they read the newspaper and did things like that. And I think if they could have heard you this morning, they would want more to go do that. I wish I could move to California and vote for the three of you when you get ready to run for something. There were two brothers in Houston. One was the mayor of Houston and one was the congressman. Oh, San Antonio. One was the mayor of San Antonio and the other was the congressman from down there. Leah and Yvette, y'all may want to get ready and decide which one of those you want. Stacy, we applaud you this morning to have this many students that were this good at this many things. We threw all we had at them and they didn't bat an eye. They came right back at us. So congratulations to you as well for their wonderful performance today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank